Bava Batra Daf Kaf Aleph Amud Aleph, Education, Kabil Vaasfi Ketורא. So we have an opportunity today to get insights from the Gemara on an approach to educating young children. And the whole Gemara is very fascinating, but we'll focus on one part of it. The Mishnah says, and this is how it comes into Bava Batra, we're talking about neighbors, and Eino yachol limchot biyado v'lomar, Eino yachol lishan, lo mikol hapatish, v'lo mikol harechaim, v'lo mikol hatinokot. A neighbor can't say to his neighbor, you're making too much noise, I can't sleep at night because of various different things which the Mishnah says is entitled to do in his house. And one of them is kol hatinokot, the sound of children. That, says the Gemara, is not talking about the person's own children. Sefer ata'an letinokot shel beit rabban. This is talking even if the person is holding classes for children, he's educating children in his home. Not a situation where he's got lots of classes and lots of teachers, that he's got a whole Talmud Torah going on in his house. But we're talking about a situation where he's got some children who come and he teaches them, and there's a noise, the children come and they go. And this is talking umitakanat Yoshua ben Gamla va'elach, the time of Yoshua ben Gamla and onwards. Yoshua ben Gamla is quite a controversial character. He was a Kohen Gadol in the time of the second Beis Hamikdash, and controversial because his wife bought him the Kohuna Gadol. His wife was very wealthy, and we've learned before, she actually bought the position for him. But he's talked about it in a very complimentary way in this Gemara. We must remember this man for good. He did an amazing thing for Klal Yisrael. Yoshua ben Gamla Shmo, his name is Yoshua ben Gamla. She'ilmale hu nishtakach Torah mi-Yisrael. Because were it not for him, Torah would have been forgotten in Yisrael, whatever that means, but Torah would not have flourished the way it did, because he institutionalized learning. Initially, says the Gemara, it says, "V'limadatim," you're going to teach your children Torah. So people taught their children Torah. It was done at home. It wasn't done as an institution. The problem was there were children who didn't have fathers or didn't have competent fathers, so they didn't learn Torah. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Gamla came, v'tiken shiyu moshivin melamdei tinokot b'chol medina medina v'chol ir ve'ir. He established schools, Talmud Torahs, yeshivas in every little town. That there had to be a Talmud Torah, there had to be a school for children to learn. That was very progressive at that time. And a child starts school at 6 or 7 years old. Until 6 years old, says Rav to Rav Shmuel bar Shilat, who was a teacher, don't accept less than 6-year-olds. Mikan ve'elech kabil. Once they're 6, accept them into your school. Vaasfi ketורא, and stuff them with Torah like an ox. Which is not that doesn't sound so progressive, does it? But we'll have a look at it. These are the two things that I want to look at. The one is Tosfos' question from Pirkei Avos, and the second thing is this idea of stuffing the children like oxen. Tosfos asks the question and says, it says in Pirkei Avot, when it tells us the appropriate age for different things. So a very important Mishnah to learn well, to understand. And one of the great Perushim on that Mishnah is the Tiferes Yisrael, who explains the Mishnah as the whole aging process, starting from 5 years old, how one develops, how one evolves, and how each decade of aging makes one specifically geared towards a specific type of development. There are certain things one can develop as a 30-year-old that you can't as a 20-year-old, as a 40-year-old, as a 50-year-old, and to understand the value of aging and what each decade is meant for. And really important for each of us as individuals, as we evolve and we grow older, is to understand what each decade is meant for and how to focus on that decade. And the Tiferes Yisrael explains it very beautifully, all the way from 5 to 100, what a person's evolution, the nature of a person's evolution. The Mishnah tells us that Chumash, you start teaching a child Chumash at 5 years old. And it's interesting because at 5 years old, a child is open to stories. So Chumash and Tanakh, the child, you can give the child as much as you want, not even as much as the child wants. The child will always be open to listening to stories. And Tanakh is a story. So you have an opportunity to transmit to the child in those first 5 years of learning the whole story of Jewish civilization. The child can get that. And it's so clear that Jewish intelligence, and everybody knows that we're known for that, is not, all the science makes it very clear, it's not because we're somehow genetically superior than anybody else. There's no genetic difference in that respect at all. It's the way learning, and particularly Gemara learning ultimately, has always been part of the Jewish psyche, and that becomes an epigenetic capability. We learn all the time. We never stop learning. And we learn in complex ways. We learn in deep ways. We learn in multifaceted ways. I've often said that if I were to start an educational institution, I would only teach 3 things: English, math, and Gemara. That's all a child needs today. The rest he can get online. A child needs English because that's the language to communicate. Communication is important. It's the global language of communication. Math because that's the language of technology. And Gemara, because that's how to think. And then a teacher just has to stimulate a child's curiosity. That's all a true teacher has to do. If a child is curious and knows Gemara, English, and math, that's all they need. They can accomplish whatever they want. There's no limit to what they accomplish. So instead of having all these different subjects and all these different teachers and the expense involved, get the best English teacher, the best Gemara teacher, and the best math teacher. And that's what the child needs. And the Torah we start teaching them at 5 is Chumash. At 10 years old, the child has an enormous capacity to absorb like a sponge. So at 10 years old, you start teaching Mishnah. And you've got 5 years to give the child the whole of Shas, like you're learning Mishnayos every morning. You've got 5 years to give the child the whole of Shas. The child doesn't question why is this and what is that, and there's a steer from this thing to that. That's not how the mind of a 10 to 15-year-old works. It absorbs, it wants to know. So you can teach them Mishnah after Mishnah after Mishnah. By the time they're 15, they know Shas. Then you start with Gemara. Now the child's a teenager. The mind has developed to the question of wanting to question, to analyze, to extrapolate, to explore. That you start at 15. But Tosfos' question is, the Mishnah says you start Chumash at 5. Why did they start over here? Why did Rav tell Reb Shmuel Bar Shilat start at 6? Don't accept any child under 6. When I learned this Gemara, I thought, well, that's quite simple. Probably what the Mishnah means is, as a father, you can start teaching a child at 5 years old, but you don't send him off to school. You send him off to school at 6 years old, then he's ready to go into the social environment of a school. So the difference would be between a school and private teaching at home. And I found, in fact, that's what the Tashbetz says in a tshuva. It was very interesting in the Otzim Meforshim at the back of the Gemaras, where it collects notes that were written on the sides of the Gemaras of various great Lamdonim among the Acharonim. And they curated together in the Otzim Meforshim. And I found this Tashbetz brought in the name of the Tiferes Yisrael, the very same Tiferes Yisrael that we've just been speaking about, but I couldn't find it anywhere. And then in a later edition, I found it in the name of Rabbi Gedalia Lipshitz. Rabbi Gedalia Lipshitz was the father of the Tiferes Yisrael, interestingly enough. And he, in the side of his Gemara, writes that the Tashbetz says the difference is whether you send him to school or you teach him at home. That being the case, I didn't know why Tosfos doesn't answer that way. Tosfos answers, the difference is bari legamri. If the child is really healthy and strong, you start at 5. If the child's average, you start at 6. That's the difference. Why didn't Tosfos answer the way that Tashbetz answers, that the difference is teaching privately or teaching at school? And I think the answer is in the Gemara in Ksubis, which Tosfos actually references. And the Gemara there says that if you start halomed beno pachot mi ben shesh, if you start your child learning Chumash, listen to this, at a year before 6 years old, you start him while he's 5. Chaverav ratzin acharav ve'enan megi'in oto. His friends will never catch up to him. That's the value of that extra year. We think, he'll start a year later, it's okay, not so serious, he'll be... No. You can never catch that up. You can never make that up. You are robbing the child of competitive advantage by starting him a year late. A competitive advantage he'll never make up for. The difference between a child that starts Chumash at 5 and one that starts at 6 is so great. Imagine one that starts only at 10, that hasn't learned much Chumash until he's 10, or until he's 11 or 12. That's how Tosfos answers it. That being the case, what's interesting, if we look at our Gemara, this case of Yeshua ben Gamlo, he instituted schools for children who didn't have parents. If that meant that you only took children into school at 6, but fathers taught from 5, then orphans would be at a terrible disadvantage. That wouldn't be fair. If you say that starting at 5 gives a child an unbelievable competitive advantage, in the case of an orphan, he only goes to school at 6. That's unfair. That's why Tosfos holds it can't be that way. It must be that if a regular child goes at 5, then Shmuel Bar Shelat would also accept a child at 5. When Rav says don't accept them until 6, he's talking about children who are average, who are normal sort of children. But a child who's bright and healthy and can stay in school that amount of time, that you start from 5, the same as a father starts on 5. But what's important here for us is just to understand that importance of that early education and how much a child absorbs by that early education. What does this mean, the force feeding of the child? Vaasfile. Rashi says, Ha'achileu v'hashkeyu Torah ba'al korcho. Force feed him with Torah. Kashor shenotnin alav ol al tzavaro. Like an ox, you put a yoke on the ox's neck. You don't say to the ox, my little child, how are you feeling today? Do you want to go to school today? Do you feel like school? Would you like to start learning? Or would you rather play with your friends, do some sports, take it easy? We don't want to pressure the child. Got everything in the right time. Says Rashi, you force feed the child. Why? What does that mean? Rabbeinu Gershom says, "Klomar tein alav ol Torah kamo l'shor zeh she'ofsin oto bar kocho u'machnisin bo ha'ma'achal k'dei sheyesh shamen." How do you fatten an ox? You fatten an ox by force feeding it. If you want a healthy, good, fat ox, that's what you do. So he talks not like Rashi, that it's about putting a load on the back of the ox. He says, no, it's about nourishing the ox. You don't ask the ox, do you feel like dinner, my little ox? Would you like to eat it at the moment? Or would you like to skip your meal today? You force feed the ox and it gets strong. So you force feed the child. Not very progressive. Before we understand it deeply, it's important also to understand the Mashor. The Mashor was an educator. The Mashor is 16th century. We've talked about the Mashor before. The back of every Gemara, and Lomdim through the scholars through the ages since the time of the Mashor have said you can't really understand the Gemara and Tosfos certainly without understanding Mashor. Mashor is written very briefly. It's hard to understand, but it's a really important achron to learn with one's Gemara. And he also wrote Chidushei Agadot. When the Gemara goes on to an Agadic track, he explains the Agadah as well. The Mashor was Reb Shmuel Eidlis, Reb Shmuel Eliezer Eidlis. And the reason he was known as Eidlis is because his mother-in-law was Edel, or Adele. And she was wealthy. And for the first 20 years of his career, she supported not only him and his wife, but also his yeshiva. So for those 20 years, and he was so grateful to her that he took her first name as his last name. Edel, I belong to Edel. I'm here because of Edel. And so he was an educator. He taught in yeshiva. She supported the yeshiva. So he writes here, Kashor la'ol v'karov yoter le'inyano, Pirish Rashi b'Perek Nahara, K'turah kashor she'atam malito, Ayin Sham. He says in Ksubis, Rashi explains it more like Rabbeinu Gershom, that this is about feeding the ox, not loading the ox. Ayin Sham. V'nire od deke'amar desafile sheyilmod imo benachat that doesn't mean open the child's mouth and force the food in, because that's not what you do with an ox either, says the Mashor. He says you do that with a camel. With a camel is very stubborn and you really do force feed it. But an ox you don't do that. An ox you do it benachat k'moshe ma'achilin hashor b'yadayim. If the ox isn't eating well, you take the ox gently and you feed it with your hand. One by one, individual attention for the ox. So the Mashor gives us a bit more of a perspective. Yes, you don't give the child the opportunity to choose whether or not to learn. You compel the child to learn, but you do it in a delicate way. You do it in an individual way, in a way that the child can tolerate it and can integrate it. But yes, you do force the child to learn. But there's another element too of this force feeding, which comes in a piece of Reb Chaim Shmulevitz that I happened to be learning with my son last week, where he brings an amazing story that I'd never heard. And I don't remember hearing this from Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, but it's in the Sefer, and I've quoted here in the source sheets, that Yisro said to Moshe, you can marry my daughter, this is a Yalkut, on one condition, and that is your first son goes to a training school for Avodah Zorah, that he learns in a non-Jewish idol worshipping school. And Moshe accepts it. And his intention, which afterwards is he brings Yisro around. But Reb Chaim Shmulevitz says, how could Yisro have said that? We know that by the time he met Moshe, he'd already given up idolatry because he'd found out that it was worthless and meaningless. He'd given it up already. What is he making such a condition with Moshe, that your first son should be raised in Avodah Zorah, in idolatry? Where does that, what does it mean? Explains Reb Chaim Shmulevitz that Yisro was a very modern grandfather. And he's said, I don't want your child to grow up with taking Yiddishkeit for granted, taking his Jewishness for granted, that he's born with it, that he never had a choice. I want him to choose it. Give him the choices, send him to a non-Jewish school, and let him choose to be Jewish. And I say he's very, very modern and progressive. Today, not only do people want to do that with their children, to give them the choice to be Jewish or not to be Jewish, or how Jewish to be, but even gender. Don't impose a gender on your child. Let your child choose what gender. Don't give the child a blue blanket or a pink blanket in the hospital. Let your child choose what they want to be. That's how far we've gone with the sense of choice. And our Gemara is telling us, when it comes to Limud Torah, no choice. This is just the child grows up with this. And Yisro didn't understand, explains Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, that in Torah, the higher level is to do something as an Eved Hashem, not out of choice. Yes, there's a great thing to come to it yourself and make a decision. I want to do it, but there's still some ego in that. At the end of the day, why are you a religious Jew? I chose to be. I've understood it. I grasped it, like Yisro. Yisro was a Baal Tshuva in the sense that we use the term of Baal Tshuva today. But says Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, it's much greater not to be a Baal Tshuva. It always worries me, that sense of a Mokum Shebal Tshuva Emdim En Tzadikim Gemurim Yicholim Lamed. You want to say somebody who's lived a terrible life for 30 years or 40 years becomes a Baal Tshuva, and he's greater than somebody who was born into Torah and has never been out of Torah all his life. What does that mean from Reb Chaim Shmulevitz? It's clear. A Baal Tshuva is somebody who's frum, and knows Torah, and does an Aveira, and then does Tshuva. That's one kind of thing. But somebody who's born into ignorance, and doesn't know, is raised secular, and decides at some points in his life, as many people here, decide at some point in your life to become religious. That's a great choice. It's a wonderful thing. But it's not as great as somebody who did it without a sense of choice. That's a very Jewish concept. That commitment to Torah, not from a sense of choice, but because that's who we are. Because we are Avdei Hashem. It's not like you don't choose or you don't choose. You don't choose your nationality. You don't choose your gender. And you don't choose your Jewishness. Your Jewishness is as innate to you as your gender is. It's as innate to you as your nationality or ethnicity is. It's not something you choose. It's something that you're born with and you embrace. And you embrace as an Eved Hashem. And you want to give the child some of that. Yisro didn't understand that it's much greater for the child to grow up without the choice than to make the choice. Making the choice is still me. I made the choice. Growing up without it is, why am I religious? Why do I keep Torah mitzvahs? Because I'm Jewish, because that's how it is. There's no choice. There's no question about it. That's the highest level of all to be. And we'll have opportunities to discuss this idea in greater detail at other times. But meanwhile, for us to understand just how early it was in our history that Jewish education became a value beyond anything else, the amount of effort and Mesiras Nefesh that was put into Jewish education, and the importance in those early years of education to give the child as much as possible. The child is a sponge. You're giving the child the whole foundation from which he or she will grow and develop for the rest of their lives, a foundation that it's very difficult, if at all possible, to catch up at a later stage. Don't deprive the child of greatness because you want to give the child freedom and choice. Greatness is a higher value in Torah than freedom.